Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Linda. I'm delighted to have George with us. He's a linguist, author, and English language trainer with over 20 years of experience. Welcome, George.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to talk about advanced vocabulary and how it can elevate someone's fluency in English.
So, George, let's start with the basics. Why is advanced vocabulary so important for fluency? Isn't it enough to know common words and phrases?
While common words and phrases are essential for everyday communication, advanced vocabulary allows you to express yourself more precisely and vividly. It's like the difference between painting with a broad brush and using fine, detailed strokes. Advanced words help you convey subtle emotions, complex ideas, and nuanced perspectives. They also make your speech more engaging and impressive.
So, for someone looking to expand their vocabulary, where should they start? Are there specific categories of words they should focus on?
Focusing on words that fall into categories like emotions, abstract concepts, and descriptive language. For example, instead of saying happy, you could use words like elated, ecstatic, or jubilant. These words not only sound more sophisticated, but also convey different intensities of happiness.
Well, let's dive into some of these advanced words. Can you give us a few examples of words that describe emotions and how they differ from their simpler counterparts?
Well, let's take the word sad. Instead of saying sad, you could say melancholic, which implies a deep reflective sadness, or despondent, which suggests a sense of hopelessness. Another example is angry. Instead of angry, you could say livid, which means extremely angry, or irate, which implies a more intense, almost uncontrollable anger.
I can see how using these words would make your speech more expressive. What about abstract concepts? Are there any advanced words you'd recommend for discussing ideas or philosophies?
Okay, let's take the concept of freedom. And instead of just saying freedom, you could use autonomy, which emphasizes self-governance, or emancipation, which implies liberation from oppression. Another example is change. Instead of change, you could say metamorphosis, which suggests a profound transformation, or paradigm shift, which refers to a fundamental change in approach or underlying assumptions.
Wow, those words really add depth to the conversation. Now, let's talk about descriptive language. How can advanced vocabulary help someone describe things more vividly?
Yes, Linda. Descriptive language is where advanced vocabulary truly shines, for instance. Instead of saying a beautiful sunset, you could say a resplendent sunset, which conveys a sense of dazzling beauty. Or instead of a loud noise, you could say a cacophonous noise, which suggests a harsh, discordant sound. These words paint a more vivid picture in the listener's mind.
I love that. It's like turning a simple description into a work of art. Now, George, I know that learning advanced vocabulary can be challenging. What strategies would you recommend for someone who wants to incorporate these words into their everyday speech?
Great question, Linda. The key is to practice consistently and in context. Here are a few strategies. Read extensively. Books, articles, and essays expose you to advanced vocabulary in context. Keep a vocabulary journal. Write down new words, their meanings, and example sentences. Practice speaking. Try to use new words in conversations or even your thoughts. Listen and imitate. Pay attention to how native speakers use advanced vocabulary and try to emulate them.
Those are excellent tips. I especially like the idea of keeping a vocabulary journal. It's such a simple yet effective way to track progress. Now let's talk about some common pitfalls. Are there any mistakes people make when trying to use advanced vocabulary?
Definitely. Well, one common mistake is overusing advanced words or using them incorrectly. This can make your speech sound unnatural or pretentious. It's important to understand the nuances of each word and use it appropriately. Another mistake is focusing too much on memorization without understanding the context. Words are tools and they need to be used in the right situations.
That's such an important point. It's not just about knowing the words, it's about knowing how and when to use them. George, can you leave our listeners with a few advanced words they can start using today?
Of course, here are 3 words I'd recommend. Ephemeral, meaning short-lived or fleeting. For example, the beauty of the cherry blossoms is ephemeral. Serendipity, meaning a fortunate coincidence. For example, meeting my old friend in Paris was pure serendipity. Quintessential, meaning the most perfect example of something. For example, she is the quintessential team player.
Those are wonderful words. I can't wait to start using them myself. A question that's on the minds of so many language learners: how many words do you need to learn to become fluent?
Fluency is a bit of a tricky term because it means different things to different people. For some, fluency means being able to hold a conversation without stumbling. For others, it means speaking like a native speaker. Linguistically, fluency generally refers to the ability to communicate smoothly and effectively in a language, even if you don't know every single word or grammatical rule. It's about being able to express your thoughts and understand others without constant hesitation.
So, fluency isn't about perfection, it's about functionality. Now, let's get to the heart of the matter. How many words do you need to know to reach that level of functionality?
Well, Linda, the answer isn't as straightforward as you might think. It depends on what you mean by fluency and what your goals are. But let's break it down. Research shows that native English speakers typically know between 20,000 and 35,000 words. However, you don't need anywhere near that many to be fluent in English as a second language.
That's a huge range. So how many words does a language learner need to know to be considered fluent?
For most learners, knowing around 5,000 to 10,000 words is enough to achieve fluency in everyday conversations. Let me explain why. The most common 1,000 words in English cover about 80% of everyday speech. If you know these words, you can handle basic conversations, ask for directions, order food, and talk about simple topics. But to have deeper, more meaningful conversations, you'll need to expand your vocabulary to around 5,000 words. At that level, you'll be able to discuss a wide range of topics, express nuanced ideas, and understand most of what you hear in movies, TV shows, and casual conversations.
That's fascinating. So 5,000 words is the sweet spot for fluency?
For most learners, yes, but it's important to note that not all words are created equal. The key is to focus on high-frequency words, the ones that are used most often in everyday communication. For example, words like understand, important, and problem are far more useful than obscure words like sesquipedalian, which means using long words, by the way. So it's not just about the number of words you know, but which words you know.
That's such an important point. Quality over quantity, right? So how can learners identify these high-frequency words?
Great question. There are many resources available, such as frequency dictionaries, which list words in order of how often they're used, which often have pre-made decks of high-frequency words. Another strategy is to immerse yourself in the language by watching TV shows, listening to podcasts, or reading books. Pay attention to the words that come up repeatedly. Those are the ones you should prioritize.
That's such practical advice. Now let's talk about the different levels of vocabulary. For example, how does knowing 1,000 words compare to knowing 5,000 or 10,000 words?
Let's break it down. 1,000 words. At this level, you can handle basic conversations and understand simple texts. You'll be able to talk about everyday topics like food, weather, and family, but you'll struggle with more complex ideas. 3,000 words. With 3,000 words, you'll be able to understand about 90% of everyday conversations. And most of what you read in newspapers or online articles, you'll also be able to express yourself more clearly and discuss a wider range of topics. 5,000 words, this is where fluency really starts to kick in. You'll be able to understand almost everything in casual conversations, movies, and TV shows. You'll also be able to express nuanced ideas and engage in deeper discussions. 10,000 words at this level, you're approaching native-like proficiency. You'll be able to understand complex text, specialized vocabulary, and subtle nuances in meaning. This is the level you'd need for academic or professional settings.
That's such a helpful breakdown. It really puts things into perspective. Now, I know that learning thousands of words can feel overwhelming. What strategies would you recommend for building vocabulary efficiently?
Absolutely, Linda. Here are a few strategies that I've found to be effective. Learn in context. Instead of memorizing random words, learn them in sentences or phrases. This helps you understand how they're used in real-life situations. Use spaced repetition. Apps like Anki or Quizlet use spaced repetition algorithms to help you remember words more effectively. Focus on thematic vocabulary. Learn words related to topics you're interested in or need for your work or studies. Practice active recall. Test yourself regularly to reinforce what you've learned. Immerse yourself. Surround yourself with the language through movies, podcasts, books, and conversations.
Those are fantastic tips. I especially love the idea of learning in context. It makes the process so much more meaningful. Now let's talk about common mistakes. Are there any pitfalls learners should avoid when building their vocabulary?
One common mistake is trying to learn too many words at once. It's much better to focus on a small number of words, and really master them before moving on to new ones. Another mistake is neglecting to review. Vocabulary is like a muscle. If you don't use it, you lose it. Finally, some learners focus too much on obscure or advanced words while neglecting high-frequency words. Remember, it's better to know 1,000 useful words really well than 5,000 obscure ones.
That's such great advice. It's all about balance and practicality. George, can you leave our listeners with a few actionable steps they can take today to start building their vocabulary?
Here are 3 steps you can take right now. Identify your goals. Are you learning English for travel, work, or academic purposes? Focus on the vocabulary that's most relevant to your goals. Start small. Aim to learn 5 to 10 new words a day. Use them in sentences and review them regularly. Immerse yourself. Spend at least 15 to 30 minutes a day listening to or reading something in English. Pay attention to new words and add them to your vocabulary list.
When we talk about vocabulary size, we often hear that native English speakers know around 20,000 words. But what does that actually mean? Are we counting every single form of a word, like friend, friendship, and friendly, as separate words?
That's a great question, Linda. The short answer is no. When linguists talk about vocabulary size, they typically count root words. So for example, the word friend is one root word, and its derivatives like friendship, friendly, friendliest, and friendless are all counted under that single root. This means that when we say a native speaker knows 20,000 words, we're talking about 20,000 root words. Not every possible variation.
That makes so much sense.
Exactly. And this is important because it shows how efficient language learning can be. Once you know a root word, you can often guess the meaning of its derivatives. For example, if you know friend, you can probably figure out what friendship means, even if you've never seen the word before.
So, for language learners, focusing on root words is a smart strategy. Now, let's talk about advanced vocabulary. What exactly makes a word advanced, and why is it important for fluency?
Advanced words are typically those that go beyond the basics. They allow you to express more precise, nuanced, or sophisticated ideas. For example, instead of saying happy, you could say elated, jubilant, or euphoric. These words convey different shades of happiness, and using them can make your speech more vivid and engaging.
And having the right vocabulary can make all the difference when you're exploring new places or describing your experiences. So, George, I've got a list of advanced words and phrases related to travel, and I'd love for you to break them down for us. Let's start with package holiday. What does that mean, and how can someone use it in a sentence?
Great point, Linda. A package holiday is a type of holiday where you purchase the travel and accommodation together as a single package. It's often more convenient and sometimes cheaper than booking everything separately. For example, you could say, we booked a package holiday to Spain, so our flights and hotel were all included.
That's such a useful term, especially for people who love the convenience of having everything arranged for them. Now, let's move on to breathtaking view. This is a phrase I personally love. What does it mean, and how can we use it?
Breathtaking view is a wonderful phrase. It describes an extremely beautiful view that literally takes your breath away. For example, from the top of the mountain, we had a breathtaking view of the valley below. It's a great way to emphasize how stunning something is.
I can already picture that in my mind. Now, how about charter flight? How is that different from a regular flight?
Charter flight is a cheaper form of flying than a scheduled flight. It's often used by tour operators for package holidays. Unlike regular flights, which operate on a fixed schedule, charter flights are usually booked for specific trips. For example, we took a charter flight to Greece, and it was much more affordable than a scheduled flight.
That's good to know for budget-conscious travelers. Next up is check-in desk. This is something we all encounter at the airport, but how would you define it?
The check-in desk is the place at the airport where you register for your flight, all right, and deposit your luggage. It's where you get your boarding pass and drop off your bags. For example, we arrived at the airport early and headed straight to the check-in desk.
Simple but essential. Now, what about departure lounge? What's the difference between that and the check-in area?
The departure lounge is where you wait for your flight to be called after you've checked in and gone through security. It's usually filled with shops, restaurants, and seating areas. For example, we had a coffee in the departure lounge while we waited for our flight to be announced.
Now let's talk about far-off destination. This sounds so poetic. What does it mean?
A far-off destination is somewhere a long way away, often exotic or remote. It's a great phrase to use when talking about dream travel locations. For example, for our next vacation, we're thinking of visiting a far-off destination like New Zealand or the Maldives.
That sounds amazing. Now, how about hordes of tourists? This one feels a bit negative. What does it mean, and how can we use it?
You're right, Linda. Hordes of tourists refers to large crowds of tourists, often in a way that feels overwhelming. For example, we visited the famous landmark, but it was so crowded with hordes of tourists that we could barely enjoy it.
That's definitely something to keep in mind when planning trips. Now, let's move on to local crafts. What does this term refer to?
Local crafts are objects or items that are produced locally, often by hand, and using traditional methods. They're a great way to bring home a piece of the culture you're visiting. For example, we bought some beautiful local crafts like handmade pottery and woven baskets at the market.
I love supporting local artisans when I travel. Now, what about long weekend? This seems straightforward, but how would you define it?
A long weekend is an extended weekend holiday that includes an extra day, usually Friday or Monday. It's a great opportunity for a short getaway. For example, we're planning a long weekend in the countryside to relax and unwind.
Perfect for a mini vacation. Now let's talk about out of season. What does this mean, and why might someone choose to travel during this time?
Out of season refers to traveling outside of the main holiday period when there are fewer tourists, and prices are often lower. For example, we decided to visit the beach resort out of season A to avoid the crowds and save money.
That's such a smart travel tip. Finally, let's end with picturesque village. This sounds like something out of a storybook. What does it mean?
A picturesque village is a very pretty village, often charming and photogenic. It's a great phrase to describe idyllic scenic locations. For example, we spent the day exploring a picturesque village with cobblestone streets and colorful houses.
That sounds like a dream. George, thank you so much for breaking down these advanced travel-related words and phrases. I feel like I've just taken a mini vacation through vocabulary.
Thank you, Linda. It's been a pleasure. I hope your listeners feel inspired to use these words and phrases in their own travel stories.
I'm sure they will. And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in to English Global Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep expressing yourselves fluently. Goodbye.